I'm 56 now, and most mornings, my hands still move like they did when I was 20, tightening bolts by feel, testing a hinge with my thumb, listening for trouble before I see it. I sit on this porch with coffee gone cold and watch the ridge light up in slow bands. And if you heard me in town, you'd still call me practical to a fault. That part stayed. I still don't trust big talk. I still think most stories get bigger every time they're told. But there was a winter when I was barely holding a farm together. And if you'd seen me then, you would have known I wasn't arguing with anybody because I didn't have enough left in me to argue. That winter started 3 months after Lena died. Folks said that first season is fog and casseroles and paperwork. They were right about the paperwork. They were wrong about the fog. Fog implies softness, and there was nothing soft about it. It was sharp-edged, every hour of it. She had run this place with me for 29 years, and suddenly every task had 2 ghosts in it. The way she used to do it, and the way I failed to do it now. I didn't move back into our bedroom for a long while. I slept in the mudroom on a narrow cot with an old army blanket, close enough to the coop wall to hear any disturbance. If a hen flapped hard at 2 in the morning, I was up in boots before I was fully awake. I told myself I was being responsible. Truth was, I couldn't stand the quiet in the house. The land had come from my father's side, Ozark ridge ground, thin topsoil over stubborn rock, cedar pockets, oak on the shoulder, and a creek that looked harmless until winter taught it otherwise. We ran layers, not by factory numbers, just enough birds to feed local contracts and still know each one by its habits. Lena kept names in her head for the oddballs. I kept numbers in ledgers and feed ratios in a grease-stained notebook. Between us, it worked. Alone, it looked like a puzzle dumped on the floor. The long freeze set in early that year, and I named it because naming a thing makes it easier to fight. Not easier to beat, just easier to face. The long freeze wasn't one storm. It was a cycle that kept returning before we recovered. Black ice on the back slope, then a hard thaw that turned the lower run to soup, then a snap so cold the water lines shuddered, then rain that swelled the creek and pushed hunger uphill. When woods get lean, predators get bold. Raccoons worked latches with little thief hands. Foxes tested weak boards. Feral dogs ranged wider than usual. I'd spent years staying 1 step ahead. That winter, I felt half a step slow every day. I ran pre-dawn rounds in silence because talking to myself made the loneliness louder. Flashlight in my left hand, egg basket in my right, boots finding the same path by habit. Open gate, check mesh, count birds by movement and sound before full light. The coop had its own dawn language. Soft clucks, a complaint trill from the red hens, feeder chain tapping wood when one jumped too hard. Any wrong note stood out. A panicked burst. A corner gone still. Feathers where feathers shouldn't be. I started each morning braced for proof that I had failed again. By the second week of December, I'd filled 4 ledger pages with losses and circled each date so hard the pen tore paper. 2 eggs smashed in one night from a raccoon reach. 3 gone after sleet loosened a lower panel. 1 pullet injured and set aside in a warming crate under the brooder lamp. Numbers don't cry, which is why I trusted them. They also don't lie to comfort you. I'd stare at those columns and feel smaller than a man has any business feeling on his own property. Supper became a standing ritual of not much. I'd heat canned stew, sit on an overturned feed bucket by the brooder lamp, and eat while chicks peeped from behind cardboard windbreaks. That lamp cast a little copper circle that made the rest of the room feel farther away than it was. The chicks would settle when I talked low, so I started reading old receipts out loud, part numbers, seed invoices, fuel totals, like I was giving testimony to a jury that only weighed ounces and warmth. Sometimes I laughed at myself for that, a short, dry sound with no joy in it. Most nights I just listened to their tiny breathing and tried to believe keeping them alive was enough purpose for one man. Church friends did what church friends do. They brought food in foil pans and said kind, helpless things in the doorway, while shifting weight from one boot to the other. Carla Mims handed me tuna casserole and squeezed my forearm. "Earl, you call if you need anything here. Anything at all. We mean that." I nodded because that's what you do. I appreciate it. Her husband, Ron, looked past me at the coop lights. "You shouldn't be out there alone all night. Get some sleep. Birds are birds," I heard myself answer flat. "Birds are the mortgage." He opened his mouth, then shut it. Carla touched his elbow, and they left me with enough leftovers for 4 days, and no clue what to do with the part of me that felt raw and mean for no reason I could fix. The feed store was worse, mostly because I kept going. I'd stand by the mineral bins in my canvas jacket, waiting on cracked corn, and hear men talk weather, tires, and high school ball scores. Once in a while, somebody would lower his voice when I walked up, like grief might be contagious. One morning, Clem Jarvis glanced at my cart and said, "You're buying like it's still full production. Thought you might cut back this season." "I thought about it," I said. "Wouldn't blame you if you did." That was the whole exchange, maybe 20 seconds, but it sat in my chest all day. Cut back, scale down, hold what you can. Reasonable words, practical words. They sounded too much like surrender. Dottie Pike caught me at the mailbox on a day when the sky had that iron colour that means freezing rain by nightfall. Dottie had lived on the next ridge longer than anybody could account for exactly. She wore men's work gloves with the fingers cut off, drove a faded truck that always smelled like apples, and spoke in short lines that landed harder than sermons. "You look worn smooth," she said, like a weather report. "Feel about the same." She watched my gait a long second, then the tree line beyond it. "Winter's got teeth this year." "It does," she nodded once. "Sometimes the woods keep watch better than we do." I gave a tired snort before I could stop it. "That sounds like mountain talk, Dottie." "Maybe," she said. "Maybe not." Then she climbed back into her truck and rolled away, brake lights blinking at the dip. I stood there with the mail in my hand and felt irritation prickling under my skin. I didn't want sayings. I wanted stronger wire and dry footing. I wanted one night without waking to a crash. I wanted one morning where no shell was cracked, no hinge bent, no telemark added to a page that already looked like bad news. I wanted, most of all, to stop measuring my worth by eggs and latches, and whether I could protect small things from a season that was built to take. 3 days later, black ice put me on my side, coming down the pump house slope. I landed hard enough to see white for a second and lay there staring at cedar branches stitched against a pale sky. Gus, my old blue heeler, trotted up and licked my glove like he was checking if I'd quit. He had gone grey around the muzzle and stiff in one hip, but he still made every round with me. He still slept across the mudroom threshold like a bouncer with no salary. I rubbed his ear and said, "You and me, buddy." And even to my own ears it sounded thin. That night, I moved my cot closer to the coop wall. Wind pressed at the siding in long, low pushes. Somewhere up ridge, a limb cracked under ice and came down with that hollow report you feel in your ribs. I kept one boot on and one boot off, ready for a scramble, and stared at a water stain on the ceiling until dawn diluted the dark. Grief did a strange thing to time. Daylight chores passed in a blur of motion, then 10 minutes alone could stretch wide enough to swallow a man whole. By New Year's week, I had a routine for fear. Check the outer fence, check the run gate, check the lower corners for digging, refill feed, reset the latch twice, then once more because memory wasn't dependable when sleep was this thin. Right numbers. Heat soup. Listen. Repeat. It wasn't living, but it was structure, and structure kept me upright. On the mornings, I found every bird where it belonged. I stood still a little longer than necessary and breathed steam into my scarf like it was proof of something. I didn't tell anybody how close I came to selling the flock that month. I had the ad half written on a receipt. Layers, feeders, waterers, must haul. I left it on the table beside Lena's old ledger and couldn't make myself finish the sentence. Her handwriting ran down those pages in neat, slanted lines. Dates, hatch notes, weather margins, tiny comments like brown hen moody today, and check west hinge before next front. I traced one of those notes with my thumb and sat there until the brooder lamp clicked off on timer. If you had asked me then what I believed, I would have said what I'd always said. I believed in work. I believed in fences built right and doors shut tight. I believed a man gets what he can carry, and no more. But late one dawn, with frost silvering the gate wire and Gus standing beside me like a quiet witness, I felt that belief strain a little under the weight of the season. Not break, just strain. The ridge was so still, I could hear creek water under thin ice, and my own breath inside the wool around my face. I remember looking toward the cedars and saying, out loud to no one in particular, I'm trying. Then I stepped into another day and did the rounds again. That morning looked like all the others at first, which was part of what made it hard. I wanted a clear fight, a broken board, a track in the mud, something I could point at and say, there, that is the problem, and I can fix it. Instead, I got the long, grey hour before sunrise. Frost tight on the wire, feed dust in my sleeves, and the old ache that settled in my chest as soon as I opened my eyes. Gus paced me from mudroom to coop, toenails ticking on the concrete lip, then muffled on packed dirt. He stopped to sniff the corner post where fox scent usually lingered and sneezed once, like the cold offended him personally. I checked hinges, counted birds, lifted 2 eggs still warm from the box, and kept moving, because stillness inside myself felt dangerous. By noon, the sky had turned the colour of used steel wool. I spent 2 hours resetting the lower skirt wire where last week's thaw had loosened staples, then carried cinder blocks to brace the feed shed door, so a hard wind couldn't peel it open at night. My shoulder throbbed from the fall on the ice, and each lift sent a dull pulse down my arm, but pain had structure to it. Pain was measurable. Grief wasn't. Grief came sideways while I was doing normal things, like reaching for the red-handled screwdriver Lena always kept by the porch steps and finding it exactly where she left it in October, wiped clean, threaded through the pocket seam of her old apron hanging on a nail. I stood with that screwdriver in my hand, and the wind pushing cold through my jacket, and felt all the heat go out of me. I took supper early if a can of beans at 4 in the afternoon counts as supper, and ate, leaning against the stall partition in the barn, because the house felt too large again. The brooder lamp hummed and threw its copper circle over the newest chicks. They shifted and settled in a soft ripple, like grain poured slow. I read feed ratios out loud just to keep my voice from going stiff. Starter crumble, 22% protein for 3 weeks, then step down. Gus lay by the doorway with his paws crossed, ears tilted toward me like he was taking inventory. Don't look at me like that, I told him. I know you're smarter than half the folks at the store. He thumped his tail twice and closed his eyes. For 10 seconds it almost felt normal. Dark came early and mean. Wind drove sleet against the siding in slanted lines, and by the time I finished the evening round, the creek had started that low, swollen sound that carried farther than it should. I walked the fence with a flashlight, beam bouncing over posts and frozen ruts, and every shadow looked like trouble until it resolved into cedar trunks and stacked pallets. I found one loose latch on the secondary run, fixed it, then checked it 3 more times with numb fingers, because I no longer trusted the part of my brain that said, "Done is done." When I finally crawled onto the cot in the mudroom, I kept my coat on, and one hand wrapped around the flashlight like a child clutching a toy, only there was nothing playful in it. Sleep came in scraps. A hen rustled at midnight, and I was up. Gus raised his head, listened, then lay back down. I stayed standing there in the dark, breathing through wool, waiting for panic to tell me where to run. It never came, and that unsettled me almost as much as if it had. 3 days passed in that same narrow groove, chore after chore, sky never fully clearing. Each evening ending with me at the table where Lena's ledger sat open beside mine. Her pages were neat and spare. My pages looked like I was trying to press certainty into paper by force. I started adding side notes she never would have written. Wind from northeast after midnight, creek noisy at 2, hens restless in west boxes. I was documenting weather and behavior like a man making a case to a judge who might never show. In my head, I kept arguing with myself in circles. You're tired. You're raw. You're seeing patterns where there aren't any. Then a counterpoint answered just as steady. Tired men still know their own gates, and raw men still know what a disturbed flock sounds like. Late one afternoon, I hiked the back line where the ridge dropped toward the creek bend. Ice glazed the rocks in thin, clear plates that snapped under my boots with a glassy click. The cedars held their smell even in that cold, sharp and resinous, and the oaks creaked overhead in slow complaint. I stopped at the old stump where Lena used to set her coffee thermos during spring fence checks, and stood there longer than I intended. I wasn't praying. I wasn't talking much. I just stood and watched my breath drift and disappear. A crow called once from down the draw and then went quiet. Even the creek seemed to pull its voice in. The whole ridge settled into a hush so complete, I could hear my jacket fabric scrape when I moved my arm. It felt less like peace than waiting, though I couldn't have said for what. On the next pre-dawn round, the first thing I noticed was what I didn't hear. No alarm chatter. No sudden wing beats. No chain rattle from birds jostling for feeder space. The coop breathed in its usual rhythm, low and contented, like a room full of sleeping people. I paused at the gate with my hand on the latch and listened hard enough to make my ears ache. Gus stood at my knee, tail down, not tucked, making no sound. Usually he gave one low warning huff when we stepped out that early, like he was announcing we were on duty. That morning, he just watched the tree line and blinked slowly. I swung the light down and saw a line of creek stones set across the path in front of the run gate. Not a pile. Not debris washed up by weather. A line, 6 smooth stones crossed over one another in pairs, each one about the size of my palm, wet sheen catching the beam. I knew every rut on that path. Those stones had not been there the night before. I crouched and touched one with my glove. Cold, slick, real. No footprints around them in the frozen dirt near the gate, just my own from the evening check and the faint heel drag where I had turned to leave. I straightened up too fast and my lower back barked. "All right," I said to no one. "Who's messing with me?" The cedars gave me nothing back. No laugh, no retreating crunch, no movement at all. I stepped over the stones, did the count, gathered eggs, and checked the perimeter twice. Nothing broken, nothing missing. By habit, I looked for signs of raccoon hands at the mesh, fox digging at corners, dog prints near the lower fence. I found none. What I did find were tracks on the muddy section past the pump house, where yesterday's brief thaw had turned topsoil to dark paste before the temperature dropped again. The prints were broad and deep at the heel with long toe marks, too wide for any boot I owned and too clean for worn tire tread. They skirted every puddle instead of cutting through, set down with careful spacing, as if whoever made them had chosen each step to avoid churning the path. I stood over one and set my work boot beside it. My boot looked small. I wish I could say I handled that with dignity. I did not. I took my cap off, looked toward the cedar shadows, and muttered, "Excuse me," like I was squeezing past strangers at church supper. Then I heard how that sounded, out there at 5:30 in the morning speaking manners into frozen trees, and I let out one short laugh. It surprised me so much I laughed again, just a little, and had to wipe my nose on my sleeve because the cold had it running. First real laugh in weeks, and it came courtesy of mystery footprints and my own lack of pride. 2 mornings later the stillness returned, deeper this time, like the ridge itself had agreed to hold quiet for a while. The hens were calm before dawn and calm after. No scattered feathers, no scratch marks at the wire. Gus trotted ahead to the corner of the run where the cedar line started, then stopped and stood with his tail low, not stiff, not fearful, a slow side-to-side motion like he used when greeting old friends who came up the drive. The hair along his back stayed flat. He leaned forward slightly, sniffed, and sat down. Sat down. My dog, who barked at delivery trucks, squirrels, and his own reflection in the storm door, sat polite as a deacon and watched the trees as if waiting his turn in conversation. I followed his gaze and saw only trunks and shadow, and a thin thread of morning mist lifting from the draw. No figure, no movement I could swear to, just that same concentrated quiet and the sense, steady as a hand on a gate, that I was not alone and not being hunted either. I waited a full minute, maybe more. My breath fogged. A drop of meltwater slipped from a cedar bough and hit a dead leaf with a tiny tick. Gus glanced back at me once, then returned his eyes to the tree line and gave a soft huff that sounded almost friendly. That day, I wrote a new line in the ledger margin under weather and losses. No losses. Stones at gate again. Unusual tracks near pump house. Dog calm at timber edge. I stared at that note for a long while before closing the book. It looked foolish and exact at the same time, which matched how I felt. I still believed in latches and wire and the plain math of feed and weather. I still believed tired men could misread things, but something on that ridge had started moving around my life with a kind of care I couldn't fit into any box I had built. And for the first time since Lena died, my attention wasn't only pointed at what might be taken from me. Part of it turned toward what might be given. I stood at the table a little longer with my hand on the closed ledger, listening to the wind ease against the siding. And then I did what I always did when I had no answer for a thing. I went back to work. I grabbed the rake, walked the path from mudroom to run gate, and smoothed the top layer of frozen mud until it looked like brown corduroy. If somebody was playing games on my property, they would leave a clean print this time. If weather was doing tricks with my eyes, the ground would prove it. If I was simply worn thin and looking for meaning in random marks, a plain test would expose that too. Gus followed in that slow, stiff-hipped way of his, nose low, breath puffing white in short bursts. I set the creek stones back where I had found them, crossed in their pairs in front of the gate, because moving them felt rude in a way I could not explain. Then I did the evening chores and left one extra thing by the fence post where the path widened, a split red apple from the bin Lena used for pie. I told myself it was bait for raccoons, a practical move. I knew while I was placing it that I was lying to myself. Night settled hard, then cracked clear by midnight. I woke twice to hens shifting on roosts and once to a branch scratching the roof, nothing urgent. In the dark, I lay there with one arm over my eyes and tried to keep my thoughts from circling the same drain. I told myself this couldn't be real. I told myself grief makes a man superstitious if he lets it. Then another thought, quieter and steadier, kept showing up anyway. Even tired men can still recognize deliberate care. At first light, I stepped out, and the cold hit so sharp it made my teeth ache. The raked path held tracks like ink on paper. Mine from last night. Gus's half-moon paw marks. Chicken scratch near the lower corner, and one set of deep prints, broad through the ball and heel, spaced farther apart than any normal stride, curving around the apple instead of over it. The apple was gone. In its place sat 3 blackberry clusters, dark and clean, and set side by side on a flat stone like produce at a stand. I crouched until my knees complained, looked close for stems or leaves or signs they had been dropped from a bird's mouth. Nothing. The berries looked hand-placed. I reached out and touched one with my bare fingertip. Still cold from the night, but not frozen solid. Fresh enough to stain. Out of season by weeks on this ridge, unless you knew, sheltered pockets I didn't. "All right," I said softly to the cedars. "That's new." Gus sniffed the berries, then me, then sat and looked toward the tree line with his ears relaxed. No warning growl, no hackles, just patient attention, like he expected somebody to step out and ask for a cup of coffee. By the second week of January, my mornings had changed in a small but measurable way. I still checked corners, hinges, and wire first, but I also looked at the ground for signs of what had visited without taking anything. The grief stayed with me, but curiosity started taking up some of the space it used to own entirely. It was a strange relief being puzzled instead of crushed. I ran reasoning cycles while I worked because that was how my brain stayed useful. First theory, pranksters. Failure point, nobody from town was hiking an icy ridge before dawn to place berries and reset latches without stealing feed or leaving boot marks. Second theory, I was forgetting what I did at night. Failure point, my own prints in raked ground showed otherwise, and the secondary latch I'd left undone on purpose one evening was fastened tight by morning. Third theory, some animal behavior I didn't understand. Failure point. No animal I knew crossed stones in pairs and set fruit in orderly rows. I didn't like any of those outcomes. I liked less that each day narrowed them further. I took the blackberry clusters inside, washed them, and set them in a saucer by Lena's ledger without fully deciding why. Physical proof, maybe company. At the feed store that Friday, I finally said part of it out loud, though I cut the edges off so nobody could laugh too hard. Clem Jarvis was weighing cracked corn behind the counter, and I told him, "You ever seen raccoons latch a gate back shut after they're done?" He squinted like he was deciding whether I was joking. "Latch it shut? No. Open, yes. They're little thieves with fingers. Why?" "Found my outer latch fastened twice now after I left it loose." He slid the paper sack across, dust on his gloves. "Wind catches those old hinges, could bounce it closed." "Against the hasp?" That I got no answer for. He shrugged. "You're running on fumes, Earl. That can play tricks. Get Ron to take a night watch with you." I nodded because arguing in a feed store was never worth it. "Maybe I will." I didn't. On the drive home, I heard his words and rejected them in the same breath. Running on fumes was true. Tricks was likely in some cases. But not this. Not with tracks in fresh rake lines and fruit laid out cleaner than I could have managed with numb hands. That afternoon, I fixed a torn section of roofing felt on the brooder shed. The wind had worried one corner loose, and I was on the ladder cussing quietly at a stubborn nail when Gus let out a single, low huff from below. Not alarm, more announcement. I looked down. He was standing at the base of the ladder, tail moving slow, eyes on the trees. I followed his line and caught a brief movement between two cedar trunks at about chest height, dark against dark, then gone. Not fast, not sneaking. Just a shift, like somebody stepping back to give me room. I climbed down slower than I went up. I picked up the old coffee can of nails, set it on the porch rail, and found myself doing that same ridiculous manners ritual. I touched the brim of my cap toward the timber and said, "Roof's about done. Appreciate the warning." Then I laughed under my breath at myself for speaking to empty woods again. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it was real, and it did not hurt. The next morning brought sleet, the kind that ticks on metal and glass for hours without committing to full rain. I worked inside more than out, mended 2 feed sacks, sorted hardware and copied losses from my daily pages into a monthly total while the brooder lamp hummed. When the weather eased near dusk, I pulled on my canvas jacket and headed for the far fence line to check drainage channels before dark. Gus came with me, shoulder brushing my leg every few steps. Blue hour settled over the ridge, that narrow time when snow patches glow and tree trunks go almost black. The air smelled of wet cedar, mud, and creek water rising somewhere below. Halfway to the hedgerow, I heard a sharp flutter and a thump, then stillness, then one more frantic wing beat from the brush ahead. My first thought was fox hit. I started forward faster. What I saw stopped me in place. At the far edge of the fence, maybe 40 yards out, where old barbed wire met wild plum and volunteer oak, a huge, dark figure was kneeling in the wet grass. Kneeling, not crouched to spring, not towering over anything. One long arm reached toward the ground with a slowness that looked deliberate, even at distance. In front of him, a hen pheasant lay half-tangled in a rusted snare line that someone had set illegal and forgotten, one wing pinned awkwardly. The bird kicked once, panic all through it. The figure paused, hand open, then moved again with careful fingertips, easing the loop up and off the wing joint without jerking. I remember every small sound in that minute, sleet dripping from a fence staple. Gus breathing through his nose beside me, steady as sleep. The faint metallic ping when the snare ring hit a rock. No roar, no threat display. Just the soft brush of wet fur against dead grass as that massive shape shifted weight to keep from crushing the bird while he worked. My brain split in two. One part was cataloguing scale like an auditor, shoulders wider than my feed room door, arm length near absurd, torso heavy and balanced like an old oak trunk. The other part was paying attention to behavior, and behavior did not match danger. He freed the bird, then pulled both hands back and waited. The pheasant sat stunned for half a beat, then exploded upright and ran under the hedge, wing lopsided but moving. The figure stayed still until it cleared. I wanted to back away. I wanted to step closer. I wanted to call somebody and ask what in God's name I was looking at. And I knew there was nobody I could call who would help that moment become more sensible. So I stood there with rain needling my face, every nerve awake, and watched him lift the snare wire between 2 fingers, like it offended him. He turned his head then, slow and unhurried, and looked directly at me. Distance saved me from details, but not from the fact of him. He was taller by far than any man I'd known, dark-furred and broad, with a stillness that felt old rather than wild. He did not move toward me. He did not square up or posture. He simply held the look a second, then lowered his gaze to the ground in front of him, set the snare down away from the fence line and leaned back a fraction, as if to show space between us. Gus took 3 steps forward, stopped, and sat. I heard my own voice come out rough and quiet. Evening. The figure gave one small nod. It was not dramatic. It was not theatrical. It was the same sort of acknowledgement you give at a gate when two people meet, carrying tools, and neither wants trouble. Then he rose. The size of that movement should have frightened me and somehow didn't. It was controlled, careful, almost formal in the way he kept his hands low and open. He stepped backward once, twice, into the blue-black line of cedars, and the trees took him in. No crashing exit, no broken limbs, just presence, withdrawing. I stood there until my gloves soaked through and my fingers went numb. Eventually I walked to the spot by the hedge, picked up the snare wire and coiled it. Old steel, mean little device. I carried it home and dropped it straight into the burn barrel by the shed, then crushed it flat with a shovel head until it was useless. At the table that night, I opened both ledgers, mine and Lena's, and wrote in the margin with a hand that shook only once. Pheasant freed at back hedge, dusk. Large watcher knelt, worked snare gently, backed away. No threat. Dog calm. I set the pen down and pressed my palms to the wood until my breathing slowed. For the first time in months, when I lay on the mudroom cot and listened to the hens settle, I was not counting what I had lost. I was replaying an act of care I had no framework for, and grief, for one long, quiet stretch of night, loosened its grip enough for wonder to sit beside it. Wonder sat beside me so quietly that night I almost mistook it for exhaustion. I lay on the cot with the army blanket pulled to my chin, listening to the hens rustle once and settle, and I kept replaying that kneeling shape at the hedge, those careful hands working a cruel wire loose from a bird that had nothing to offer in return. I told myself this couldn't be real, same as I had for days. The argument sounded thinner now. Real or not, my birds were calm, my latches were set, and my old dog trusted the dark beyond the fence more than he trusted delivery trucks. I got up an hour before first light and stepped into a cold that felt brittle enough to crack if you spoke too loud. Frost had grown over the run-gate chain in delicate white beads. The crossed creek stones were still there, but different this time, shifted into a wider arc like a small doorway. Just beyond them sat a neat stack of split oak kindling, dry as if it had come from a covered rack, not a wet January woods. I touched the top piece and found no rime on it. Freshly placed. Useful. Not random. Gus came up beside me and leaned his shoulder against my leg. He looked toward the cedars and gave that soft, friendly huff again. I looked too and saw nothing moving, only the pale trunks and low mist in the draw. Still, I took off my cap and held it against my chest, out of plain reflex. "Morning," I said, feeling foolish and serious at the same time. That'll save me a trip to the woodpile in this mess. I carried the kindling to the mudroom and lined it by the stove. Then I did rounds, and for the fourth morning straight, there were no losses, no cracked shells, no signs of panic. The hens moved around me with their usual complaints about feed timing, which I took as a blessing. Their routine had come back before mine had. That mattered more than I could explain to anybody who hadn't watched a flock unravel under stress. By the third week of January, I had started leaving one small offering after evening check. Never in the coop, never where it would draw scavengers. Half an apple once, a biscuit heel another time, a tin cup of well water set on the flat stump by the cedar edge when the temperature dropped hard. I wasn't trying to train anything or test loyalty. I was acknowledging a pattern of care with the only manners I knew. Some mornings the offering was gone. Some mornings it sat untouched but moved a few feet, as if handled and set down again. Twice I found gifts in return. Late blackberries once more, and a braided strip of river grass looped around a smooth stone that fit my palm. I kept that stone in my jacket pocket and the grass braid on the shelf above Lena's ledger. Physical proof, if anyone ever asked. More truthfully, they felt like evidence that gratitude could move both directions without words. Clem caught me studying fence staples at the feed store and asked if I was sleeping any better. I weighed telling him the plain version and decided against it. What came out was, "I'm sleeping some, flocks steadier." He nodded toward the storm clouds stacking west. "You lucked into a quiet patch then. Won't last. Weather report says another freeze rain cycle this weekend." "Yeah," I said. "I'm bracing for it." He lifted a brow at my cart. "Extra posts?" "Lost enough corners this year, not losing more." That was all. He rang me up, and I drove home with wire, staples, and salt blocks rattling in the truck bed, thinking how strange it was that my life now contained one truth fit for town, and one truth fit only for this ridge. The weather broke dirty that Saturday, sleet turning to freezing rain by late afternoon, every surface glazing over. I spent hours reinforcing the west run where runoff usually chewed at the base. Gus stayed near the porch, stiff hip bothering him in that damp cold, but he kept watch with his ears. At dusk, while I was sinking a brace post, he stood and faced the timber, tail low and gently moving. I followed his line and caught a full silhouette this time. Not a flicker. Tall, broad, still. 50 yards maybe at the cedar edge where shadow met silver light. He stood with hands down and open, body angled slightly away from me as if to say he could leave if I needed him to. I set the post driver down slow. My heart was banging in my throat, not from fear exactly, more from the scale of finally not pretending anymore. "I'm Earl," I said into the rain hiss. "This is Gus." Gus sat. Of course he did, polite as a church usher in a fur coat. The figure tilted his head once. Then, in one measured movement, he lowered himself to a crouch so his height didn't tower over the fence line between us. That one choice landed harder than anything. He was showing me he understood what his size did to a man's nerves, and he was easing it on purpose. I took 2 steps closer, boots sucking in mud. He didn't retreat. He didn't advance either. He held the distance we had, steady as a boundary line, and kept his gaze soft, not fixed hard like a challenge. I could make out more now. Dark fur matted by rain along the shoulders, long forearms, hands big enough to palm a feed bucket, and eyes that caught the low, light amber brown, calm and watchful. "I don't know what to call you," I said, voice shaking despite myself. "But I see what you've been doing." He dipped his chin. A tiny motion. Enough. We stayed like that for maybe a minute, rain tapping hood and wire and leaves. Then he rose, stepped backward into the cedar shade, and paused once more. One hand lifted, not high, just to chest level. Palm turned slightly outward. Not a wave exactly. An acknowledgement. He turned and disappeared between trunks with almost no sound. I stood in freezing rain, grinning like a fool, then remembered I was 56, and alone in a pasture, smiling at trees. I laughed at myself all the way to the mudroom, where I peeled off wet gloves and told Gus, "Well, buddy, I just introduced us to a man nobody in town would believe in." Gus sneezed and leaned against my shin. Like that settled the matter. 3 nights later, the long freeze hit with new teeth. Wind came in hard from the north and drove ice pellets under every eave. Around midnight, a chorus of sharp, frantic clucks snapped me awake. Not the usual shifting. Alarm. I was in boots and coat in seconds, flashlight in hand, heart already braced for loss. Gus was up too, stiff but ready, shoulder brushing the door as I threw it open. The yard was a blur of sleet and shadow. My beam jumped across the run and caught movement at the far corner, where the old drainage ditch had undercut the fence skirt. 2 feral dogs were testing the weak spot, lean shapes in the weather, darting in and out with hunger making them reckless. The hens were piling to one side inside, wings beating the wire in panic. I shouted and ran, slipping once, catching myself on a post. The dogs flinched but didn't fully break. Then the tree line shifted. He stepped out from the cedars with no rush, just huge and deliberate, moving straight to the fence breach and placing himself between the dogs and the run. No lunge, no snarl. He simply stood and widened his stance, shoulders square, one hand resting on the top rail as if it weighed nothing. The dogs froze, ears flattening, and backed off in quick, uncertain steps. One gave a short yip, turned, and bolted downhill. The other followed, gone in seconds. My beam shook over wire and mud and that towering shape in sleet. He looked toward me, then down at the washout, then back at me again. A question, clear as language. Fix this now. Yeah, I said, breath tearing in my throat. Yeah, we fix it. I dropped to my knees in the mud, dragged a spare board from the stack by the post, and jammed it over the eroded gap. Water kept sheeting through, trying to pull it loose. I reached for a second brace and cursed when numb fingers fumbled the staple pouch. He knelt on the outside of the fence, close enough now that I could hear his breathing, slow and steady under the storm. With 2 fingers he pressed the board firm against the wire while I drove staples through mesh into wood. Every hit of the hammer rang sharp in the night. "Hold it right there," I muttered, working fast. "That's it. Don't let it shift." He didn't shift, not an inch. When the first board held, I shoved a cinder block against the base inside the run. He rose, took 2 long steps to the collapsed ditch edge, and lifted a waterlogged cedar limb thicker than my thigh. He set it along the outside channel at an angle that redirected the flow away from the weak corner. Not random muscle. Smart placement. He added a second limb, then tamped both with his palms until they locked against a root flare. Inside the run, the hens quieted by degrees, panic dropping to nervous clucks, then to that low, restless mutter they made when danger passed, but nerves still buzzed. Gus stood just behind me in the sleet, eyes on our visitor, tail low and calm. That trust kept me steady more than any prayer could have. I grabbed 2 more boards and moved down line, checking for fresh undermining. He shadowed the outside perimeter while I worked inside, always keeping the fence between us, matching my pace post for post. At one point, my flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled into a puddle. Before I could reach, a massive hand set it upright within arm's length, beam still on, never crossing into my space. Deliberate, careful, helpful. "You're saving my birds tonight," I said louder over the wind. "I know that." He looked at the coop, then at me, and gave that same small nod. We worked another 20 minutes, maybe 30. Time went strange in weather like that. By the end, the breach was braced with boards, blocks, and redirected runoff. The dogs didn't return. The hens settled enough that I could hear individual sounds again. Feeder chain tick, one old barred hen fussing from her preferred roost. The ordinary life noise I had feared losing every hour that winter. When I finally straightened, my back screaming, he was standing near the gatestones. Sleet silvered his fur. He reached down and placed something on the top rail, then stepped back 2 paces. I moved closer and found one of my own loose gate pins, the one I'd been searching for since Monday, and beside it a short length of baling twine I used for quick lash repairs. He had found what I needed in the dark and brought it where I could use it. Small thing, maybe. It hit me hard anyway. "Thank you," I said, and my voice cracked on the second word. He held my gaze one quiet second, then turned toward the cedars. At the timber edge he paused and glanced back at the coop, like a last check, then disappeared into the storm-soft dark. I stood there, soaked through, one hand on the fence, the recovered pin in my palm. Behind me, my flock breathed in steady waves. Beside me, Gus leaned into my leg, warm even through wet denim. I felt grief still living where it had lived for months, but no longer as the only weight in me. Something else had taken hold too, something sturdier than hope and less noisy than faith. I had been seen in my worst season by a being big enough to break my world and gentle enough to help me keep it whole. The creek answered that thought with a sound like freight rolling over loose bridge bolts, deeper and closer than it had been 10 minutes earlier. I turned toward the draw and saw the dark waterline where there should have been pasture, flood runoff spreading in a wide sheet past the lower fence and angling for the barn. The sleet had thinned to hard rain, and every rut was now a narrow stream. I shoved the recovered gate pin into my pocket, grabbed Gus by the collar to steady him on the slick grade, and started down toward the barn doors at a half run that my knees didn't appreciate. Behind me the coop held, but the whole low end of the place had started to move. Inside the barn, cold water was already pushing under the threshold in ripples. It found every shallow dip in the packed dirt floor and joined itself into a slow, rising skin that reflected the hanging bulb in broken gold. The lower stack of feed tins sat in its path. 2 nesting crates we used for overflow sat on the ground where I had left them after cleaning. Lena's flock ledger was still on the side table by the wall where I'd been comparing notes at supper, and the thought of that paper soaking through hit me with a sharpness I couldn't explain to anybody who never kept their life in penciled margins. I set the flashlight on a nail, yanked the closest crate onto a pallet, and heard Gus bark once, short and urgent, at the open door. He was there again, outlined by rain, one hand on the doorframe to keep from swinging it wide in the wind. He did not come in until I backed 2 steps and pointed where the water was driving. "Boxes," I said, voice rough from cold and panic. "Up high if you can. Feed too. Keep it dry." He dipped his head once and moved with that same deliberate care, even with floodwater tugging at his legs. He crossed the threshold without bumping a hinge or scraping the stacked tools by the wall, which looked near miraculous given his size. He lifted the first nesting box, as if it were empty kindling, set it on the higher pallet beside mine, then reached for the second and aligned it flush so they wouldn't tip. No wasted motion, no breaking stride, just work. I grabbed feed tins and slid them one by one toward the center aisle while he carried the heavier metal bins that I usually dragged with both arms and a lot of stubborn language. Water climbed from my boot soles to my ankles, then to my shins. It came in pulses now, each surge a little higher than the last, the creek pushing through the lower swale and into every place I had always trusted to stay dry. The old wall clock above the tack shelf read 2:17 by the time we had all 6 tins up on blocks. I remember that minute because it was when I realized we might actually keep ahead of it. Then the side table jolted in a fresh surge, and Lena's ledger slid, tipped, and dropped to the wet floor. I lunged and nearly went down on the slick boards. He got there first. One massive hand flattened gently over the book, keeping it from drifting into the muddy wash, and he lifted it with 2 fingers and thumb, careful as if it were a hatchling. He looked at me, then at the driest shelf near the stall door, waiting for direction. "Top shelf," I said, and my throat closed on the words. "Please, top shelf." He set it there square and true, far from splash, then stepped back so I could see it was safe. Not one page bent. Something in me gave way right then, and it wasn't graceful. I braced both palms against the stall door and folded over like I'd taken a body blow. For months I'd held every feeling behind chores and checklists and the next repair, because if I stopped moving, I was afraid I would not start again. Standing in that barn with floodwater around my legs, watching this quiet giant save chickens, feed, and my wife's handwriting with more care than some people gave their own words, I lost the fight to stay composed. I cried hard and ugly, shoulders shaking, breath hitching, forehead against rough wood that smelled like hay and old soap. I wasn't as alone as I thought, I heard myself say, and then again louder because it had to get out to be true. I wasn't as alone as I thought. Gus pressed along my calf, steady and warm, leaning his weight in that way he used when my back went out, and he wanted to hold me upright. The hens in the adjacent room, rattled by weather all night, made a few nervous clucks and then settled into low, even murmurs. That quiet settling did me in all over again. My whole season had been fear of losing one more thing. Now, the sound around me was survival. I stayed bent there for a long minute, maybe two, letting the grief finally move instead of hardening in place. I did not feel fixed. I felt opened. There's a difference. When I straightened, wiping rain and tears with the same sleeve, he was a few paces back near the door, giving me room like he understood dignity mattered too. His gaze was lowered, not avoiding me, just soft, respectful, patient. "Thank you," I said, and this time the words held. For all of it. For the birds. For him. I touched Gus's neck. For that ledger. He lifted one hand to chest height, palm in, then turned and stepped back into the rain. I thought he was leaving for good in that moment, and part of me wanted to call him back, though I had no right to ask more. Then another surge hit the threshold harder than the others, splashing against the doorposts, and he changed direction, angling down toward the run channel where the overflow still tried to carve itself deeper. I followed to the doorway and watched him wade chest deep through the fastest section, plant his feet against the pull, and lever a floating cedar round out of the current. He set it crosswise against two buried rocks to split the flow away from the coop foundation, then did it again with a second log, building a rough brace that turned water towards the old drainage cut instead of under the run. Every movement was controlled, strong as machinery, careful as craft. I wanted to run out and help him, and I knew I'd be swept off my feet in that current. So I stayed where I could still do useful things, hauling loose boards to higher hooks, tying the barn doors half shut against back gusts, checking that the pallet stacks were stable. When I looked up, he was already back at the threshold, water streaming off his fur in dark lines, breathing slow through the cold like it was merely weather and not misery. He crouched, placed something on the dry lip of the sill, and nudged it toward me with one knuckle. It was a river-smoothed stone, oval, grey, with a faint white seam through the middle. Warmed from his hand despite the night. Not a tool, not bait. A gift plain enough that even a man like me couldn't misread it. I picked it up and closed my fingers around it. Heat held for a few seconds, then settled into my palm like a pulse. He met my eyes at full height when he stood. Up close, with the bulb light behind me and stormlight behind him, I could see those amber-brown eyes clear for the first time, calm and old and entirely without malice. He lowered his gaze after a breath, a gesture so modest it felt like being trusted. I nodded because words were small by then. "I'll keep watch too." The tension in his shoulders eased. He stepped back once, then again, never turning his back until he had distance, and then he pivoted toward the cedar line. Rain softened to mist as the front edge passed. The worst wind moved east. By the time he reached the first trees, the sky over the ridge had begun to pale at the seams. He did not look back again. He didn't need ceremony. He moved into the fog between trunks with the same unhurried rhythm he had always used around my place, and the woods accepted him without a crack of branch or dramatic sign. One moment he was there, broad as a gatepost in the dawn grey light, and the next he was depth and shadow, and then nothing I could point to. I stood at the barn door with Gus against my leg and the warm stone in my fist, until the rain thinned to dripping. The creek still ran hard, but the redirected channel held. Water stopped climbing and started, almost politely, to level off. Behind me, the hens gave their first ordinary morning noises, indignant and hungry, as if night had been rude but survivable. I laughed once through a sore throat, wiped my face, and got to work, finishing what the storm had started. By full dawn, the flood had crested and begun to fall an inch at a time along the fence posts. The braces held. The coop floor stayed intact. Every bird answered count. I dried Lena's ledger page by page near the stove, though it hardly needed it, and set the Riverstone beside it while I boiled coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. Gus slept under the table, paws twitching in dreams, worn out and satisfied. When I stepped back out to reset the gate, the crossed creek stones had been widened into a clean ring just off the path, as if marking the place where help had passed and been received. I left them exactly as they were. I still do. That same morning, with the ring of stones bright against the wet dirt, I used the baling twine he had set on the sill to lash a temporary brace on the west gate until I could sink a proper post. The loose pin went back where it belonged. I drove it home with 3 hammer taps and felt a foolish surge of relief at hearing metal seat cleanly in metal. Then I went inside, dried my hands, and opened both ledgers at the table. Lena's pages were safe, edges barely damp. Mine looked swollen from weather and handling, but readable. I logged the floodline by inches, listed every crate and feed tin moved, and wrote one new line beneath it all. Riverstone received at barn threshold. Kept on person. I slipped that stone into my right jacket pocket before I stepped out for the noon check. It rode there with my pocket knife and a length of wire, same as any working tool. The grass braid stayed above Lena's ledger. The blackberry saucer, long since dried and stained at the rim, I washed and set back in the cabinet because it had done its job. I had already written those mornings down. The flattened snare wire stayed where I left it in the burn barrel, hammered useless and rusting into nothing. I had no need to keep cruelty as a souvenir. By the 3rd morning after the flood, the yard had stiffened back to frozen ruts and crusted mud, and the hens acted insulted that breakfast was 4 minutes late. I carried 2 full egg crates to the porch, just as Dottie Pike rolled up in her faded truck with a box of apples under one arm, and that unreadable face she always wore when she already knew the answer to her own question. She looked at the crates first, then at me. "How many did you lose in that rise?" "None," I said. "Not one bird, not one egg to predators either." Her eyes narrowed, not doubting, measuring. "Fence corner held?" "With help." She gave a short nod and set the apples down on my porch rail. "Thought so." I waited because that was the first time she had answered me like the conversation had started years earlier. "You ever see him?" I asked. She leaned against the post, work gloves tucked in her back pocket. "I saw tracks with my daddy when I was 16, big enough to make him take his hat off. We found a calf pulled out of spring mud the same day. No drag marks from men, no rope, no prints, but those. Daddy said leave a bucket of apples and keep your mouth decent." She glanced toward my gate stones. "I did what he said for 40 years. "That all?" "That's enough." She lifted one shoulder. "Folks who need proof won't take yours anyway. Folks who already know don't need convincing." She didn't offer drama. She didn't ask for details. She only tipped her chin toward the crates. "You keep doing what you're doing, and keep that ring clear of weeds. Manners matter." When she drove off, I stood there with cold air in my lungs and felt less like a man who had stumbled into something strange, more like a man who had been let into an old agreement. 2 Sundays later, after service, Ron Mims caught me by the church steps while people clustered around slow cooker leftovers in the fellowship hall. He rubbed the back of his neck the way men do when they're about to step where they haven't stepped before. "Earl," he said, "I said something wrong to you back in December." I remembered exactly. Birds are birds. I nodded once. He went on. "Carla told me to mind my own tone. She was right. If you want, I can come out Wednesday and help set heavier corner posts. No charge, just neighbor work." I looked at him a long second, then said, "Wednesday at 3. Bring gloves." He showed up at 3 with a post-hole digger and didn't ask one question he wasn't prepared to hear an honest answer to. We worked the West Line until dark, setting posts deeper than frost, packing gravel, running fresh wire skirt 2 feet out. At one point he glanced at the stone ring and opened his mouth, then shut it, same as he had months earlier. This time he spoke. "You want me to move those so we can run straight?" "No," I said. "We run around them." He studied my face, then gave one plain nod. "Around them, then." That was the whole exchange. It paid off more than an apology speech could have. By early March, the feed store talk had shifted from sympathy to arithmetic. Clem pulled my order sheet and frowned at the numbers. "You didn't reorder replacement pullets this cycle." "Didn't need to." He tapped the page. "You're telling me 0 predator loss since the ice storm?" I set my ledger on the counter and opened it to the winter columns. Dates, counts, hatch notes, weather margins, no gaps. "I'm telling you what's written." He looked over the rows with that same skeptical squint, but this time it softened into something like respect. "Well, I'll be. Whatever you changed, it's working." "I changed more than wire," I said. He waited for me to elaborate. I didn't. He smiled anyway, bagged my feed and said, "Town's done joking if that helps." It did help, a little. Not because I needed them to believe me, but because I was tired of spending energy on defense when I had work to do. 3 days after that, I made one phone call I had put off too long. My son Caleb answered on the 4th ring, voice guarded and polite, the way you talk to somebody you once loved easy and now love carefully. "Dad?" "Yeah, you busy Saturday?" A pause. "Depends what for." "Fence work and supper, if you can stand me that long." Another pause, shorter this time. "I can come." He pulled in Saturday morning with a borrowed trailer and city boots too clean for my place. We shook hands first, then hugged awkwardly because men in my family were raised practical and had to learn tenderness late. He walked the perimeter with me, listened more than he spoke, and noticed things fast, same as his mother used to. At the gate, he stopped at the ring of crossed stones. "You always had this?" "No." He crouched, touched one, and looked toward the cedars. "You want to tell me why we're keeping it?" I breathed once and told him everything true, plain, and in order. Not campfire style, workman style. Stones, tracks, latches, pheasant, flood, ledger, stone in my pocket. When I finished, he sat back on his heels and stared at the tree line for a long moment. Finally, he said, "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it." He nodded slowly. "I believe you, though." That was the hinge. We spent the rest of the day reinforcing the barn footings and lifting nesting boxes onto permanent pallets for future storms. At dusk, we ate chili at my kitchen table under Lena's old clock, and he asked for her cornbread recipe. I handed him the card in her handwriting. He copied it by hand instead of taking the original. Another small act of respect. Another repair. Gus made it through one more spring and then went easy in his sleep on a warm May morning, head on my boot. I buried him above the creek bend where he used to sit and watch the cedars. I set a flat river rock at the marker, Not the pocket stone, a different one, and thanked him out loud for trusting first when I could not. In the second week of October that year, I had one final clear sighting. Dawn mist, same cedar edge, same deliberate stillness. He stood far back, half in fog, and watched while I scattered feed. I took off my cap. He dipped his chin once and stepped away. No drama, no farewell performance, just the kind of leaving that honours what already happened. I never saw him full on again. 11 winters have passed since that flood night. The long freeze still comes in cycles. Raccoons still test wire. Foxes still circle on lean moons. Feral dogs still drift through now and then when weather pinches the hills. But they do not breach my runs. Not once. I rebuilt this place around what I learned. Deeper posts, raised pallets, smarter drainage, double latches, and a tension that includes more than fear. I keep the gate ring clear in every season. I leave an apple on the flat stump after the first hard freeze each year. Some mornings it is gone. Some mornings it is not. Either way, I say thank you. Now, at 56, I still fix tractors. I still mistrust grand claims. I still believe in work done right. I also believe the world holds a form of guardianship that doesn't ask for credit. That belief did not make me less practical. It made me less alone. This morning, the ridge lit up in slow amber bands while I gathered eggs, each shell unbroken and warm through my gloves. I carried the basket to the porch, set it down and touched the stone in my pocket the way other men touch a cross or a lucky coin. Then I looked toward the cedars and spoke into the quiet, steady as a man saying grace over a table that finally feels full. "Morning," I said. "We're doing all right."